400 kilograms of uranium, near weapons grade. Enough material if processed further for approximately 10 nuclear bombs. Every major outlet has run this number, and almost every outlet has drawn the same conclusion. Iran's building a bomb. Talks collapse because Iran won't stop. Iran doesn't want a nuclear bomb. Iran wants to permanently be the country that could build one in days, without ever crossing the line. That distinction isn't subtle. It's the entire story. And once you see it, Islamabad, the 21-hour talks, the collapsed ceasefire, all of it becomes completely readable. Let's start with the numbers. On May 31st, 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations nuclear watchdog, delivered a confidential report. That report stated Iran had accumulated over 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. That was a 50% increase from February of the same year. In 3 months. Here's the thing. Weapons-grade uranium is 90% enriched. Iran was sitting at 60. And according to nuclear experts, including David Albright of the Institute for Science and International Security, the technical gap between 60% and 90% is smaller than it sounds. In terms of additional work required, it's the short final step, not the long journey. If that stockpile were taken to 90%, it would be sufficient material for approximately 10 nuclear weapons. On June 12, 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency declared Iran non-compliant for the first time in 20 years. The following day, Israel launched strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and removed several of Iran's top military commanders. On October 18, 2025, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 nuclear deal, formally expired. Iran officially terminated it. European powers triggered what are called snapback sanctions. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched large-scale combat operations against Iran. Since that date, more than 2,076 people have been confirmed killed inside Iran, including at least 1,701 civilians and 254 children, as of April 13, 2026. On April 7, 2026, Pakistan brokered a 2-week ceasefire. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's crude oil passes, was partially reopened. Brent crude, which had traded around $75 a barrel before the conflict began, spiked dramatically during the blockade. As of April 14, 2026, it sits at $102.24 a barrel. On April 11th and 12th, 2026, United States Vice President J.D. Vance, alongside Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, sat across from Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf in Islamabad. It was the highest-level direct engagement between the two countries since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The talks ran for 21 hours and 14 minutes. They ended without a deal. That ceasefire expires on April 22nd. Here's the part almost nobody is explaining clearly. The mainstream coverage isn't wrong. The numbers are accurate. The timeline is real. But the coverage is treating this like a straightforward nuclear standoff. One side wants a bomb, the other wants to stop them, and the question is whether they can find a middle ground. That frame misses the actual logic of what Iran is doing. And once you see that logic, the entire situation becomes readable in a way it currently isn't. Think of it this way. Imagine you live in a neighborhood where someone has broken into your house twice. Not robbed it, restructured it, changed who was in charge. The first time was 1953, when the Central Intelligence Agency ran a verified, declassified covert operation called Operation Ajax. It removed Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the Shah, a leader favorable to Western interests. Every Iranian alive today knows this story. It isn't ancient history to them. It's the founding grievance. The second break-in was February 28, 2026. United States and Israeli forces launched what became a 40-day air campaign. Iran's supreme leader was removed from power. Key military figures were taken out. Nuclear facilities were damaged. Now you're that homeowner. Someone has broken in twice. They're currently in a temporary ceasefire, meaning they stopped shooting, but they haven't left the neighborhood. And they're telling you give up the one thing that guarantees they'll think twice before coming back a third time. What do you do? Now, this isn't sympathy for the Iranian government. It's strategic logic, and it's the only frame that explains why Iran has behaved the way it has consistently for the last 20 years. Tehran University professor Hamid Mousavi confirmed in recent interviews that nuclear advancement is Iran's, quote, negotiation tool. The International Atomic Energy Agency, in its own May 2025 report, noted there was no credible civilian justification for the specific enrichment levels Iran had reached. It wasn't civilian. It wasn't a weapon. It was deliberately, precisely ambiguous. That ambiguity is the strategy. Iran doesn't need to detonate a nuclear weapon for it to function as a deterrent. The 400 kilograms of enriched uranium stored in a location the International Atomic Energy Agency couldn't confirm, as of October 2025, isn't a loaded gun pointed at anyone. It's the fact that you have a loaded gun somewhere in your house that the other person can't find and can't remove. That's called nuclear latency. The ability to go nuclear in days or weeks without having crossed the line. Look at the two examples Iran has studied most carefully. North Korea pursued this logic to its conclusion. It crossed the threshold. It now has functional nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Nobody has launched a military campaign to remove the North Korean government. The deterrent works. Libya is the counterexample. In 2003, Muammar Gaddafi agreed to fully dismantle his weapons program. Sanctions were lifted. Diplomatic relations normalized. The international community celebrated. In 2011, NATO air power helped opposition forces remove him from power. He was gone. Iran's hardliners have a phrase for this. Not a metaphor, a lesson. The country that disarms gets removed. The country that keeps its capability does not. And there's a follow-up question worth asking. If the logic is deterrence, why hasn't Iran just gone fully nuclear like North Korea? The answer is cost. Decades of sanctions have created enormous internal economic pressure. Iran wants eventual reintegration into the global economy. And here's the key threshold status. Already achieves the deterrence. Iran doesn't need to cross the line to get the protection the line provides. Before we go further, there's an objection many of you are already thinking. Iran has repeatedly made hostile statements toward Israel. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard has funded and armed proxy forces across the region. How can this be purely about rational deterrence if the ideology is so openly aggressive? It's a fair challenge. Here's how analysts who've studied this for decades answer it. A government can hold aggressive ideological positions and still make rational strategic calculations. Iran has had the capability to trigger far larger regional conflicts for years and hasn't done so. The nuclear program isn't the ideology talking, it's the strategy talking. Both exist simultaneously. But at the negotiating table, it's the strategy that drives the decisions. Now, let's look at Islamabad through this lens. The United States arrived in Pakistan with one non-negotiable demand. Iran must make, in Vice President Vance's exact words, an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. In practice, as Al Jazeera's correspondent covering the talks reported, that meant demanding Iran surrender not just weapons, but the right to enrich uranium, even for medical and energy purposes. Iran arrived with a 10-point plan. Release $6 billion in frozen assets. End sanctions. Guarantee no future military strikes. Recognize Iran's right to enrich. Acknowledge Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. End the war in Lebanon. These aren't the demands of a country preparing to surrender its core leverage. These are the demands of a country that believes it didn't lose the war. Iran's parliamentary speaker Ghalibaf said after the talks that the United States, quote, ultimately failed to gain the trust of the Iranian delegation. That sounds like diplomatic language. It isn't. It means you bombed us in June 2025 while we were in the middle of negotiating with you. Why would we give up our insurance policy to a counterparty that has demonstrated it will strike while talks are ongoing? That isn't a hypothetical fear. It's recent, documented history. A regional source close to the talks told Axios on April 13, 2026, quote, we're not in a complete deadlock. The door isn't closed yet. Both sides are bargaining. It's a bazaar. That framing a bazaar, not a breakdown, is more accurate than any headline from the weekend. So, what does that mean for you? The Strait of Hormuz is a waterway approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Before February 28, 2026, 1/5 of all global crude oil passed through it. When Iran closed it, the disruption was immediate. Brent crude jumped from around $75 to over $100 a barrel. That number travels. It travels through shipping costs, which increase the price of everything that moves by sea. It travels through fertilizer prices, tied to natural gas supply chains. It travels through airline fuel costs, which land on every ticket. It travels through the plastic packaging around everything you buy at the grocery store. For a family in the United States, driving a normal amount, roughly 15,000 miles a year, based on the United States Department of Transportation averages, the annual fuel cost increase from sustained high oil prices adds approximately $800 to $1,200 to the household budget. That's before grocery inflation is factored in. If the ceasefire collapses on April 22nd and the strait closes again, those numbers go higher. The International Energy Agency has noted that alternative shipping routes around the Cape of Good Hope add 3 to 6 weeks to delivery times and significant additional cost. That's not a geopolitical abstraction. That's a number on a receipt. Now, here's the part that divides serious analysts. The United States' position isn't irrational. If Iran reaches full nuclear threshold status or crosses it, the consequences for regional stability could cascade quickly. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said openly in a 2018 interview that if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, the kingdom will pursue one. Turkey has signaled similar concerns. The non-proliferation framework that has held since 1968 begins to fracture. This is what nuclear strategists call the proliferation cascade. And it's the reason successive United States administrations from both parties have treated Iranian nuclear capability as a red line. The Iranian position also isn't irrational. The country has been under sustained economic sanctions for over 40 years. It watched the United States abandon a deal it had complied with a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018 for domestic political reasons. It was struck militarily while negotiating. Its senior leadership was removed by foreign action. From Tehran's perspective, the only thing that has ever reliably deterred foreign intervention is the ambiguity of its nuclear capability. Both of these things are simultaneously true. Iran expert Trita Parsi has observed that the military campaign blurred the credibility of American pressure. The war didn't achieve regime change, didn't fully destroy the nuclear program, and didn't permanently open the strait. A United States official told Axios on April 14, 2026, that the blockade announced that morning is itself part of the negotiation. A pressure tool, not a termination of talks. Here's the genuine complexity. The United States and Iran aren't negotiating over the bomb. They're negotiating over whether Iran is allowed to permanently remain capable of building one. That's a harder problem. With the narrow exception of South Africa in 1989, there's no precedent for a country voluntarily giving up latent nuclear capability without either a security guarantee that's been proven credible or a regime change. Iran has received neither. The ceasefire expires April 22nd, 9 days. President Trump has announced a naval blockade of Iranian ports. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has warned that any move in the strait will, in their words, trap the opposition in deadly whirlpools. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar is urging both sides to hold the line. France's President Macron announced he's convening a conference on a multinational mission to restore freedom of navigation in the strait. The next move depends on one thing: whether Iran believes the Islamabad proposal is the floor of American demands or the ceiling. Here's the question to sit with. Write threshold in the comments if you believe Iran will never trade its nuclear latency for any security guarantee the United States is currently willing to offer, and that the only stable outcome is the world learning to manage a CA. Threshold Iran. Write treaty if you believe there's a specific package sanctions relief, a formal non-aggression commitment, and international monitoring that Iran would actually accept. Both answers have serious people behind them. What everyone agrees on is this: the next 9 days will determine whether the most consequential energy corridor on the planet reopens peacefully or under pressure, and whether that $102 oil becomes $130 oil or starts coming back down. The 400 kilograms was never really about uranium. It was always about whether the United States can offer Iran something that makes disarmament more rational than deterrence. In 9 days, we'll find out if anyone in that negotiation has found the answer.